Welcome again to a Q&A session with the Reasonable Faith chapter directors from Latin America. We're so glad that you're here with us today. And we have a special guest in our Q&A session. This week, we have Dr. Ryan Mullins, and many of you may know him, many of you may not, but Dr. Ryan Mullins is a research professor at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. He has published over 50 essays on various topics in philosophical theology related to models of God, philosophy of time, personal identity, the problem of evil, disability theology, the Trinity, and the Incarnation. He has published many books, including The End of the Timeless God with Oxford and God and Emotion with Cambridge. Welcome, Dr. Ryan Mullins. We're so glad that you're here with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I saw recently that you were about to publish a new book from Divine Time Maker and Divine Watchmaker. How is that going?
So at the moment, I'm just having to index this book, and that's the last thing. And I hate indexing a book. It's painful. It's so boring. So it's scheduled, I think, for January. Whereas this other book called Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God through Cascade. So this is a short introduction to philosophical theology. It's also devotional. It's also very sarcastic. They let me put a lot of jokes in that publishers don't let me normally put in. That's supposed to come out, I think, next week. So that one's coming out very soon. So I'm really looking forward to that one.
All right. Well, if you would allow me a personal question, how
Mhm.
is being sarcastic and being funny and making jokes work for you in scholarly work? Because sometimes when we are doing, we as students that follow your work or work from of other philosophers like William Lane Craig or something, believe that scholarly work needs to be super serious and super academic and use big words, but you have this more of relaxed and professional assessment and approach to stuff, but without losing your personality. And that's pretty interesting. That's fascinating to me. How is that working for you?
It's a challenge because when you're doing academic writing, the peer review process, it forces you to write like you're writing a dictionary. Like it really does say you cannot be human, you cannot have a personality, you have to write in this really boring way because that's what makes things look like you're being objective and rigorous. And I'm like, I can give you all the rigorous argumentation, I can give you all the objectivity you want, but I still have a personality and I still have opinions. So let me crack a joke every once in a while. And so sometimes I'll find a publisher or a journal, they get it. They like being able to be a bit more playful, and so they'll allow me to do that. And other journals don't. So it's a challenge to say, look, all of us are human. We need to not take ourselves so seriously, precisely because we take theology so seriously. Because I know I could be wrong on all sorts of stuff. So let's just joke about it a little bit. I mean, come on.
Well, yeah, that's something that I've always appreciated about your work, and that's always why I'm always listening to your podcast. It's really fun, and I learn a lot. And many of the questions that came through by the Reasonable Faith chapter directors involve some of your work, including your podcast, including your interviews or your articles. So let's go ahead with the first question, which is a topic that I know that you're very interested in, and it's the doctrine of divine simplicity. There has been a debate for a time now between what has been labeled classical theism and neoclassical theism. In a nutshell, could you give us an overview between these two models of God?
Yeah, so the underlying concept of God is something that all the different models of God agree on. So the concept of God is that of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. So everyone agrees on that. What they disagree over is which attributes God has that explain why God's perfect, and also they disagree over what exactly does it mean to say that God is the foundation of reality, because that could be consistent with emanation, creation out of nothing, creation out of some pre-existent material stuff, eternal creation. There's a lot of options here. So when it comes to classical and neoclassical theism, let me start with where they agree. So they agree that God freely creates the universe out of nothing. So that's how they understand the claim that God's the foundation of reality. So creation ex nihilo. They also agree that God selects a particular kind of universe, a universe with a settled timeline. So there's an exact way that history will, in fact, unfold. And because of that, God has an exhaustive foreknowledge of the future. there's all these debates about how exactly God gets the foreknowledge, but the classical and neoclassical theists both agree God has exhaustive foreknowledge because he's created a universe with a settled timeline. And then they also agree to what I call the uncontroversial or the uncontested divine attributes. So they want to say, necessarily existence, eternality, omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, perfect rationality, perfect freedom, all that kind of stuff. And they're like, yeah, that's all good. Here's where they disagree. So classical theism affirms four controversial attributes. And so those four controversial attributes are timelessness, immutability, simplicity, and impassibility. And the neoclassical theist says one or more of those has to be false because they're not all coherent. So TJ Mawson, he's an example of this. He says timelessness, I love it. It's great. Impassibility and simplicity, no, get rid of those. William Lane Craig, of course, he wants to say God's timeless without the universe, but temporal with the universe. And then he doesn't seem to be a big fan of any of the other controversial attributes. So he's like, simplicity, that's just anti-biblical. Impassibility, yeah, why would you think that's true? So he'll get rid of those. Whereas like John Peckham and I, we just want to go, just get rid of all four of those controversial attributes. They're not biblical. They're not rational. Just I don't know, just be done with it. So that's kind of like the disagreements there in a nutshell.
Would these four attributes be? You mentioned that classical theism affirms all these four attributes. Are they related to each other? Like, if you get rid of one, you get rid of the other, or can you maintain one, perhaps in a nuanced way, and get rid of the other three, or are they one, everything, all or nothing, basically?
It's so when you ask your average classical theist, they will say these four attributes are systematically connected. So if you lose one, you lose them all. And I've got this paper called "Why Can't the Impassible God Suffer?" And what I try to do in that paper is I try to look at how exactly do you get impassibility being systematically connected to these other attributes. And what I argue there is you cannot. You have to make all these other additional claims. So timelessness does not automatically entail impassibility. Simplicity by itself, that doesn't get you it. Immutability and timelessness, those go together pretty easily. But I don't think that the systematic connection between them is that tight. Not as tight as the classical theist wants to say, which is why I think you're going to find someone like TJ Mawson or a lot of contemporary philosophers of religion picking and choosing which ones they want.
All right. What do you think about the labels classical theism and neoclassical theism? Because I've heard, I think Dr. William Lane Craig say that he's not a fan of the
Yeah.
term neoclassical theism, and he still wants to remain within classical theism, but so he uses the term Thomism or Thomistic
Mhm.
theism, something like that.
Yeah, when you were dealing with these labels, so these labels are labels we inherited. So they they're not the best because the term neo makes it sound like it's new, and classical makes it sound like it's old. Here's the problem with that: the neoclassical view is very, very old. Like the majority of Islamic theologians throughout history have denied divine simplicity. To just give you one example, so the majority of Islamic theologians throughout history are going to be neoclassical theists. Thomas Aquinas' teacher, Peter of Ireland, rejected timelessness, immutability, impassibility. So Aquinas' teacher is going to be a neoclassical theist. So these labels, they're unfortunate, but they're the labels that we've inherited. And if you just call everything classical, then it's hard to figure out what are we even talking about anymore. And so what I'm doing is I'm following a taxonomy of models of God that was developed by Janine Diller and Asa Kasher in their book Models of God and Alternative Ultimate Realities. So they identify things like classical, neoclassical, open theism, panentheism, pantheism, and they try to say, look, you can find all of these models represented within particular religions and across religions. So my work is just trying to clarify what these models really are, and then identify all the different thinkers and the arguments for and against the views. That's what I'm trying to do because it's messy. These labels are, they're not the best.
Yeah, I agree. We always need to start defining what we mean by all those labels because we could be talking past each other, and that has happened a lot when I'm in conversation with different people with different religions and stuff like that. Now that you mentioned Thomas Aquinas, I think his name is very particular and very important in this debate. What is the Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity?
Yeah, so one of the things I want to emphasize is the Thomist does not have a unique doctrine of divine simplicity, and in fact, I want to say there is no such thing as a unique version of divine simplicity. There aren't different versions. So the doctrine of divine simplicity has two fundamental claims. So the first claim is that God's not composed of parts, but there's nothing special about that. Thomism, simplicity does not own the market on that because the overwhelming majority of people throughout history in all the different religions who reject divine simplicity, they also say God is not composed of parts. So, so that's nothing. So there's nothing special there. Here's where you get something special. If you want divine simplicity, you need to make an additional claim. That additional claim is what's called the identity thesis. So the identity thesis is this old Augustinian slogan that all that is in God is God. So anything that you predicate of God, anything that's intrinsic to God, is identical to God. And so here's what that means. So divine simplicity is the divine attribute, which says God does not have any attributes. God does not have any properties. God does not have any immanent universals. God does not have any tropes. God does not have any exemplifiables of any sort, which is a very strong claim. There's just this undivided substance that you call God. End of story. And then you might be going, this is weird. How did we get here? Well, because there's this other controversial question we have to ask, which is what counts as a part? Because everyone agrees like God's not composed of parts. Well, what counts as a part? And so classical theists and Thomists in particular, they have a very, very permissive view of what counts as a part. So properties, attributes, those count as parts. That's why they say no attributes. Accidental properties, like being the Lord, being the creator of the universe, being the redeemer of humanity, being the judge of all men. God cannot have those because those would be parts. So God does not have the property being the redeemer of humanity. And if that sounds really bad, it's about to get worse. So just hang on a second. The Thomist also says that potential counts as a part. So if God had any potential whatsoever, which you might think, hang on, doesn't omnipotence mean God has like omnipotency? But they're like, no, any potential whatsoever counts as a part. So God's going to have to be purely actual. And then further, conceptual distinctions. I can divide up all sorts of things in my head conceptually, make all these conceptual distinctions. Anselm, Avicenna, Jacob Arminius, Catherine Rogers, many others, they'll say conceptual distinctions would count as parts, so they do not apply to God. And you might think that's just ludicrous, because just because I can divide something in my head, that doesn't mean it can be divided in reality. They're going to disagree with that. But then also when you think about the identity thesis, where are you going to sneak in a distinction in a simple God that applies to extramental reality? Because all that you predicate of God, all that's intrinsic to God is identical to God. So there's no way for your conceptual distinctions to apply to God. So that's the doctrine of divine simplicity.
All right. But if one affirms the doctrine of divine simplicity, you say that it means that God does not have attributes. But then if somebody holds to divine simplicity, wouldn't they be denying that God has the attribute of impassibility, immutability, timelessness? Because those would count as attributes,
Yeah.
right? Wouldn't that be self-contradictory?
Yes, it is. It is. It's widely, and this is something like Al-Ghazali in the Middle Ages pointed out. He's like, this is just incoherent. It's in his book on the incoherence of the philosophers. So it's right there in the title. And yeah, and this gets pointed out all the time. So Rebecca Rice, she has a paper in a handbook on philosophy of religion she wrote a couple of years ago. There's actually one of these on the shelf behind me. So what she says is she's like, divine simplicity is just deeply confusing because they'll say God's properties are identical to God, but then they'll also say God does not have any properties. And she's like, which is it? You can't really have properties being identical to you if you don't have any properties. So what's going on? So Mike Almeida has a newer paper out where he says there's a way of talking about properties, but really all that property talk just needs to be reduced down to the claim that there's just this substance that's God and that's it. And he gives examples of how we often do these reductions. So he's like, yeah, it's super confusing, but if we can clean up the language and stop talking in this confusing way to really get to the heart of the claim, which is there's just God and end of story, nothing else. But yeah, it's yeah, you're right. If you say God's got the attribute of timelessness, but he doesn't have any attributes, yeah, you've contradicted yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, because I always thought that I thought that the Thomist could escape this by not saying that God does not have attributes, but that God is his attributes. And I guess that's the only way that I would kind of make
Right.
coherent of it. But if they deny that he has attributes, then it's totally incoherent for me.
Right. Because so when we say identity, it makes it sound like I've avoided the contradiction, but then you're like, well, hang on, is God identical to a property? And you're like, no, God's a concrete particular. And you're like, okay, so does he have any abstract? No, none whatsoever. And you're like, oh, okay, so he doesn't have the attributes.
Mhm.
So what the Thomist has is these other set of problems that they generate from the way they talk. And a long-standing problem is, does this make God an abstract object? That's a big debate you see throughout the history of Thomism, is because the way they talk to avoid certain problems, it generates other problems.
I see. Okay. Now, something that also comes up in the discussion of divine simplicity and Thomism is the doctrine of analogy. Could you clarify what that is?
Yeah, so the doctrine of analogy, it's a thesis on religious language. And so it's a theory about how we speak literally of God. And you really need to emphasize this part. So when Aquinas is talking about the doctrine of analogy, he's talking about literal speech about God, not metaphorical speech, because he's got a different theory for metaphor. So when you speak univocally about God, according to Aquinas, you can speak about God univocally and creatures, God and creatures univocally, which means when you use a certain predicate, it means the same thing in both cases. So if I say Socrates is omnipotent and God is omnipotent, Aquinas is going to say that's univocal. Why? Because it's true of God, but false of the creature. He thinks those are cases of univocal predication, when it's true of God, but false of the creature. When it comes
Mm,
to statements where the predicate is true of God and true of the creature, Aquinas is going to say, well, then we speak analogically. And you might be going, what's that? He's like, well, it's where the predicate's similar, but it's not the same. It's not the exact same. So God is wise and Socrates is wise. Like that's true, right? Socrates is supposed to be wise. Well, God's wise, yeah. And Aquinas is like, it's similar, but it's not the exact same. And you might be going, well, hang on, why is it not the exact same? And he's like, well, because when we say that Socrates is wise, we just mean he's wise. That's it. Whereas when we say God is wise, what we really mean is that God is identical to wisdom. And we certainly don't mean that Socrates is identical to wisdom. And you might be thinking, hang on, that's not what I meant. I just wanted to say God is wise. If I wanted to say God is identical to wisdom, I would do that because I'm a competent language user. I would know how to make that different claim if I wanted to. So you might think Aquinas is just putting words in your mouth, and that's a common complaint here: is that like this doctrine of analogy is just changing the subjects, changing the topic.
yeah, I mean, it's so weird. I've heard it several times, but yeah, I can just get my mind around it. Um, Before we move on, just want to say to the chapter directors that are watching us that they can comment in the chat if they have any questions or would like any clarification. Please write them in the chat so I can ask them to Dr. Mullins. Now, are there sorry, are there alternatives to the doctrine of analogy, and can we really speak univocally about God?
Yeah, so there's a bit of propaganda that is snuck into contemporary theology that we need to identify. So the bit of contemporary propaganda is that all language about God is analogical. And that's just false. Because like even that statement, all language about God is analogical. Analogical to what? Like what does that mean? So we can speak univocally about God. Because even Aquinas says you can do that. So the case being like God is omnipotent, Socrates is omnipotent. That's univocal because it's false in the case of the creature. Um, and and what you need to know is the doctrine of univocity, it predates Aquinas. The doctrine of analogy, when Aquinas introduces it, his version of it, it was deeply controversial. It was very, very controversial. People did not like it. And it was completely new at the time. And so you've got people like Anselm, for example, who are earlier. They think that we need to speak univocally of God in order to do rational theology. Like you can speak metaphorically about God, that's fine. And which also shows that not all language about God is analogical, because some language is metaphor, some language is simile. But when we're doing rational theology, when we're trying to do like identify what are God's essential attributes, what is God really like, that's when you need to be able to speak univocally. So Anselm and John Duns Scotus both say you cannot do perfect being theology without being able to speak univocally about God. Uh, but that doesn't mean you cannot speak about God in terms of, metaphor sometimes, because you got to do that. God is my rock. That's fine. But yeah, we can speak about God univocally at various points.
All right. Now, when we're discussing stuff like this and talking about God's attributes and his properties, um, there's a criticism that I've always heard in the popular level that is that when we talk univocally about God, then we're blurring the distinction between the creature and the creator because we're making God like a superhuman with the same attributes as us, but elevated to the maximum level. Have you heard about this criticism and how would you deal with it?
Yeah, this is another bit of propaganda that is it's a post-liberal piece of theology, and which by itself it just doesn't mean it's wrong just because it's post-liberal, but it's just a claim that I'm like, what are you getting at? What are you really saying here? Because when I look at the actual classical tradition, there's this common claim that God is the greatest possible being, and he's at the top of the great chain of being, and he's the source of the great chain of being. And so when you're looking at that, what you see is, yeah, God is at the top, and everything that follows underneath God, that's a possible thing. It imitates God. It participates in God in some kind of way. And so when I have power, I am participating in God's power. So so there's this objection that like, oh, well, if you speak univocally about God, then like you're making God a creature. I'm like, I'm literally participating in God's power. The only reason I have power is because I'm getting it from God. How does that make God a creature? God's like the source of everything, therefore he's a creature because I can speak meaningfully and truthfully about him. That doesn't make any sense. So I just think it's a silly objection. Actually, Marilyn McCord Adams, before she died, she had a series of papers and talks she gave on this because it's called the ontotheological error, is what this objection is called. And she has a couple papers going, what on earth is the objection here? It just sounds like you're complaining and whining, but you don't actually have any real objection underneath it. And she just said it in this kind of way that only Marilyn can say it. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. There's nothing here other than just an empty complaint of you're going, I don't like this. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry. There's lots of things I don't like, but it doesn't mean there's an objection here.
Mhm. All right. Before we move to the next question, I just
Mhm.
want a little bit of clarification there. Um, is the doctrine of, well, the Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity synonymous saying that God is pure act, or is there a difference between saying God is absolutely simple and God is pure act?
So I want to emphasize again, I don't think there are different versions of divine simplicity. I think this is another piece of contemporary propaganda that is trying to distort history to make it sound like everyone throughout history affirmed divine simplicity. And then a bunch of my Muslim friends that have been chatting with about this, they say they have their own. They're not Thomists, they're Abyssinians, but they do the same kind of thing today, where they're like, well, there's these different versions, so that way all Islamic theologians really did affirm it, even though they said they rejected it. You're like, cool story. So what you have with this identity thesis and what you have with that question of what counts as a part. So simplicity is like no parts and everything's identical. What the Thomist adds is, well, we've got this act potency distinction that maybe the Neoplatonist doesn't have. Well, those count as parts. So it's a unique claim in one sense of like, here's this other thing that you didn't realize was a part and it's a part. But in terms of divine simplicity, it doesn't really change anything because all you're doing is going, oh, there's more stuff that counts as a part than you realized. So imagine I come up with a new metaphysical system tomorrow, where I've got this other nice, neat distinction between, I don't know, anything you can imagine. I'm like, oh, well, those count as parts. And therefore, God doesn't have those parts. Have I really given you a different doctrine of divine simplicity? No, I've just identified another thing that counts as a part in my metaphysics. So that's all that's really going on there. And this also predates Aquinas because it's an Aristotelian claim. So John Philoponus, who's in the 500s, some of you guys might have heard of him. He's basically the guy who first came up with what we now call the Kalam cosmological argument. So he's really important early defender of creation out of nothing. Philoponus is like, yeah, God's pure actuality. He has no potential because he's trying to be deeply Aristotelian. So there's nothing unique about Thomism here on these points.
All right. Now, well, the next question would be, on the popular level, some people present the argument for divine simplicity in the following way, for God being pure act in the following way. God is perfect. So any potentiality or change in God would imply he is moving towards a less perfect state. Therefore, it is impossible for God to have potentiality. How would you respond to this?
There's a lot of different ways. The first step is to point out this is a deeply Platonic assumption. So it's something you find in the philosophy of Plato, but it's not something you find in the philosophy of the Bible. It actually contradicts the very clear and consistent teaching about God in the Old Testament. So, for example, when you look at Hosea chapter 11, Hosea says that God does change precisely because he's not a stubborn man who lacks compassion. So this Platonic assumption says that all changes for the better or worse. And what you see in the Bible is no, not all changes for the better or worse. Some changes are just value neutral, and some changes seem like they're actually demanded by perfection. So think of it this way: God is perfectly rational and God is perfectly free. What it means to be perfectly rational is to be appropriately responsive to reasons. So if you don't change as the objective reasons in reality change, then you're not perfect. So if you do something like really bad, really sinful, that gives God objective reasons to be angry at you. If you repent, then that gives God objective reasons to forgive you. So perfect rationality and perfect freedom, they logically entail that God has to change in certain respects. And that's exactly what you see in Hosea.
All right, very well. Now, I know that, for example, Dr. Craig likes to mention that he holds that God is simple in the sense that you said at the beginning that God doesn't have parts, but he denies that the identity thesis. So would it be okay if we hold to this kind of lightweight? I think Dr. Craig calls it like that, lightweight version of divine simplicity, or should we just reject any form of divine simplicity at all?
Yeah, I've been having some chats with Craig about this. And so he was really surprised when I started telling him about Islamic theology. And so this is something that I think we in Christianity, we pretend like we know the history of Western philosophical theology, which really means we know a lot about Christian history. We don't know anything else about outside of that, which is fine. It's understandable. It's hard to read all this stuff. It's a lot of work. But as I'm doing that, as I'm trying to read all the other people and really listen to a lot of my friends who are Jewish and Muslim, you start to see this bigger picture of this debate that went on throughout Western history. And so there's this view called the attributionist view that is very, very old. And like I said, it's the majority view in Islamic thought, which says simplicity is false. God's not composed of parts because that's just crazy. No, of course not. But God has all those distinct attributes that we see in sacred scripture. God really does have omnipotence, and that's not identical to his omniscience, because what does that mean? And so I think what you have here is we've got this very old view that Christians are just unaware of. And so when we hear the contemporary propaganda that there's these different versions of divine simplicity, it's easy to fall into that. What I want to do is fight against that and go, no, no, no. I don't want to buy into your false narrative. There's this real actual history here. And there's these actual views that we need to look at and examine and say, that looks exactly like what most Christians are up to. So today, at least, because most Christians today just look at simplicity and go, what is that? What are you saying here? Or they've never even heard of the doctrine, is often the case. So yeah. So I think Craig's just mistaken on this. I understand why he wants to make these moves, but I just want to go, there's these other well-represented views throughout history. You're
Mhm.
falling in line with those. And he's like, "Oh, tell me more, Ryan." That's what been his actual response is? "Oh, just tell me more, Ryan. I don't know about this." I'm like, yeah, let me tell you a story.
Mhm. All right. Yeah, I can imagine the richness of investigating and researching about the history of all the doctrines because you can learn a lot, right?
Oh yeah, and then when you start to look at the Islamic and Jewish debates, it helps you understand a lot of the moves that different Christians are making. So Aquinas, for example, like we talked earlier, he's trying to avoid certain objections that were very common. And And actually, his first commentary on Peter Lombard's The Sentences, he affirms the attributionist view. He says God's attributes are distinct in reality, not just in your head. And then he gets in trouble by the Catholic authorities. Is one of his students, Peter of Tarentaise, was about to become the Pope, and some Catholic authorities had a lot of questions about Peter's affirming these distinct attributes. And so they start questioning Aquinas about it. And all of a sudden afterwards, Aquinas is like, yeah, there's no distinctions here. Everything's simple. And you're like, very cool. But when you learn the history here, then when you look at that episode in Aquinas's life, it helps you make sense of it. It helps you understand what's going on there, because there's this whole philosophical debate happening, not just in Christianity, but in that whole context that everybody's interacting with.
All right. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Now, before going to the next question, it involves a little bit of discussion of modal collapse arguments. Could you give us very briefly what the modal collapse arguments try to do when dealing with the doctrine of divine simplicity? And do you still think that there are versions of the modal collapse arguments that are valid?
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't think there's any argument that's shown that any of the actual versions are invalid. And then there's Catherine Rogers. She's like, yeah, those are valid. So we should embrace the modal collapse because she affirms simplicity. And I'm like, whew, okay, that's crazy. But there's a history to that too. Because like Avicenna, he's like, yeah, you have to embrace it. You wanted an argument for the existence of a simple God. I gave you one. It entails a modal collapse, and so deal with it. Okay. So, and I've met a lot of people like that. So here's the claim. So modality, modal logic, what we're looking at is the idea that some things in the world are necessary, like they have to be that way. And then some things are contingent. They do not have to be that way. And so modal logic is trying to look at that intuition that we have and figure out the right way to talk about it and the right way to make inferences. So the modal collapse arguments, this is when the distinctions between necessity and contingency get collapsed into just the one category. So some people, in order to avoid positing the existence of God, they'll say everything's contingent. There's no such thing as necessity, and you're like, whoa. Okay, that's a bold move, but I guess it avoids the conclusion that there's a necessary existent God. Sure. What you have in the case of simplicity is the argument is trying to show that simplicity entails there's no contingency in the world. Everything is absolutely necessary. So you're wearing a white shirt, I'm wearing a black shirt. It's not possible for me to be wearing a white shirt and you to wear a black shirt. That's not possible at all, because everything is exactly the way it has to be. It's all absolutely necessary. That's what the modal collapse argument is trying to show, is that that's what the entailment is, that you get this sort of claim.
Wow, it's a really, really hard pill to swallow, but well, I
Yeah.
guess some people will just do that. Okay, so the question reads, Christopher Tomaszewski holds that God is not to be distinguished from God's acts. Therefore, God is considered to be unique and a perfect act, which, since God created the world, this is a divine act, identical with God's act of creation. Tomaszewski considers the form of modal collapse argument against the doctrine of divine simplicity to be identical to a fallacious argument of Quine. 1. Necessarily 9 is greater than 7. 2. 9 is the number of the planets. 3. Necessarily the number of the planets is greater than 7. So the question is, how would you avoid this criticism that modal collapse arguments fall into the modal fallacy specified by Tomaszewski?
Yeah, so there's a common pattern I see in Tomaszewski's papers on this topic. In each paper I've read it from him, he does not articulate the actual version of the modal collapse argument that anyone is putting forward. And he puts forward these other versions and then declares those invalid. And I'm like, well, why not look at the ones that people actually articulate? That'd be a good thing. And these parody arguments that he comes up with, like the Quinean one here, they do not parody because they don't look anything like it. So when you're looking at the Quinean argument, no one who's reading that thinks that the number 9, the abstract number object number 9, is literally identical to the planets. Whereas when you're looking at the modal collapse argument against divine simplicity, the claim that the premise is very explicitly that God's act to create this particular universe is literally identical to God's existence. That's the claim from simplicity. And And so that premise I just take out of the mouths of Augustine or Aquinas or whomever. So the claims here are just radically different. So it doesn't parody at all because no one's going to say the number of planets is identical to this abstract object we call the number nine. Like that's just not what's going on in the Quinian argument. Whereas the modal collapse argument in divine simplicity really does require you to make these identity statements.
All right. Joe Smith, in some of his articles, has mentioned that the classical theist can avoid the problem by holding that the classical theist can only avoid modal collapse if God's act produces its effects in a purely indeterministic way, so that the states of affairs that are generated can vary in different possible worlds. So independent of classical theism, or if you're fully committed to classical theism, does this way out work for someone who is committed to the doctrine of strong divine simplicity?
It's a weird suggestion. So here's the claim. God wants to create this particular universe. And that act is going to be identical to himself. And so you're like, well, then it seems like you should just get this particular universe necessarily. Why? Because classical theism affirms the infallibility of omnipotence. You see this in Augustine, Aquinas, Bonaventure, Anselm, like just about and everybody. And even like anybody who rejects classical theism, they typically want to go, yeah, God's omnipotence is infallible. If God wants to get a particular result, he's going to get it. That just necessarily follows. That's what the infallibility of omnipotence means. So if God intends to create this particular universe, then it just necessarily follows that that particular universe is going to obtain. What Joe is suggesting is the classical theist could say the infallibility of omnipotence is just false. God snaps his fingers, says, I want this universe. And he snaps his fingers. And then what's going to happen? Who knows? God himself doesn't even know. It's completely up in the air what's going to happen. God could fail billions upon billions of times to produce this particular universe. That's a real possibility on this indeterministic divine action view, which is just nuts. So you lose omnipotence. You can't get anything that remotely looks like providence. And it's not even clear this could possibly be a perfect being, because a perfect being who snaps his fingers and then is just completely up in the air for like an infinite amount of times, what's going to happen? That doesn't look like a perfect being. So it's a strategy you could use to affirm divine simplicity, but you're not going to get classical theism, and you're not going to get anything that remotely looks like a perfect being. That's the single ultimate foundation of reality.
Yeah, because it seems that it turns God into this mechanical uh, possible world producing machine
Mhm.
that has no personhood. It has no personhood, right?
Well, you could still say he has personhood, because he intends to do something. That's the problem, is he intends to do something, but it just what's going to happen? I don't know. He doesn't know either. No one knows. It's not possible to know. And so you get this very unlucky, or maybe really lucky, because maybe God snaps his fingers and the first time it just happens that you get this particular universe. So God's going to be subject to this very bizarre sort of luck, and maybe he's deeply unlucky. You're also going to be subject to what T.J. Mawson calls divine bodgery arguments. So you bodge something up or you make a mistake if you intend to bring about a particular outcome, but you fail to do so. This indeterministic causation that you put into the divine life, that just makes God, I mean, almost like necessarily like bodging things up. Like so it's a very weird view. I saw recently in I was in Spain at a conference in Spain, and Augustus Equivara, who's a brilliant medieval scholar. He was really good. He was trying to defend this particular line of thought, and then Jeremy Shripik, who's this really good Catholic philosopher, he gave the commentary and he was like, you lose any sense of God's rationality, you lose any sense of omnipotence, we lose the entire like theistic story. Like this is a terrible idea. And Augustine and Jeremy had a really good back and forth, but like it's just yeah, I think the consequences are really really bad and really obvious.
I think. Well, now that you mentioned your Spain trip,
Mhm.
I'm reminded about uh, a YouTuber. He's a philosopher. His name is Enric Fernandez, I believe, and he was there. I think
Mhm.
he's from Spain, He's a very popular YouTube Catholic apologist and well, philosopher, because his YouTube channel is the purpose of his channel is to make available philosophical discussions, arguments for and against God. He's really, really good. But I think that we should start working in translating your material, because his work also emphasizes and works a lot in defense of the doctrine of divine simplicity. So we might need to work on a counterback.
There we go. There we go. That'd be good.
Definitely. All right. Now I consider myself a layman on this, because honestly, it's not a topic that I've researched as much. But when I first heard about the doctrine of divine simplicity, and every time that I hear discussion about this and Thomism and all of that, the first thing that came to mind, even as a layman that I had never heard about this, the first thing that comes to mind when you say that there's no distinction in God, and everything that is God, that God has, or the attributes are God. The first thing that came to mind is, what about the Trinity? Because in the doctrine of the Trinity, we do make distinction. God is one being and three persons, and each of the persons are not identical to each other. So wouldn't the Thomistic divine simplicity be incompatible with the doctrine of the Trinity?
Yeah, it's really obvious. All that is intrinsic to God is identical to God. The Father and Son are intrinsic to God, so they're identical to God. And then identity is transitive, so you're going to have the Father and Son identical to each other. So that's just not a Trinity at all. What you'll see some different people do is they'll say, well, they're distinguished by their causal relationships. And I'm like, okay, so let's unpack that a bit. So the Father is identical to his act of causing the Son to exist, and the Son is identical to his act of being caused to exist. You're like, cool, okay. What else does divine simplicity say? Well, the Thomist tells me all of God's acts are identical to each other, and identical to God's existence. And I'm like, oh, so the act that the Father is identical to, well, that's going to be identical to the act that the Son is identical to. So now I'm back to the Father and Son are identical to each other. Cool. What else you got? What I see some contemporary people doing is they'll say, well, what they really meant, what Aquinas really meant, or what whomever, you just doesn't have to be Aquinas, it could be Augustine, it could be whomever. What these people really meant was, when they were talking about the Trinity, they didn't mean numerical identity. They meant entitative identity, which is like you and I, we're complex beings. Like take your soul, like, for example. Your soul is not a composite being, but it is a complex being. It's not composite because it's not made of parts, but it's complex because you have different powers, different properties, different faculties. But there's just that one entity that is you, the soul. So they want to say the same thing about the Trinity. It's a complex being. There's the Father, Son, and Spirit, and they're entitatively identical in the sense there's just one being there, but they're not numerically identical to each other. And that's what the classical tradition really meant. And I want to go, well, that's unfortunate because that's not what they said. And then Thomas Marschler, who is he's this German theologian, he's a history of dogma is his area of expertise, and he says, no, when you look at the Fourth Lateran Council, the Fourth Lateran Council reaffirmed the strict numerical identity of the persons with the essence, something that scholastic theologians did not deny. So when he says, so what he's saying there is, he's like, no, when you look at all these people in the High Middle Ages, they certainly meant that these are numerical identity is what they meant, and it's what they said, and it's what the church said was official dogma. So don't start changing the story and making it about entitative identity. That's not what happened.
All right, pretty interesting. All right. Now, what about divine simplicity and daily life? Because our life as Christians or believers in God assumes the possibility of relating to God and seeing Him and see His act, His providence on our daily lives. But if the doctrine of divine simplicity is true, what implications do you think that it has for the way that we relate to God, and how does this affect the way that we see God in our daily lives?
So you remember that moment when Jesus told us, ask things of God. Like when you pray to God, ask things of him for he'll, he might give it to you. Well, if divine simplicity is true, God has no passive potency, which means that God cannot be influenced in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, God's not really related to you at all. You're like, ooh, okay. So should I ask things of God? Hey, you can do that if you want, but your prayers cannot possibly influence God at all. So if you want to engage in futility, go for it. But that seems terrible. And then the claim that God's not really related to the universe. I mean, that sounds outrageous. So Catherine Rogers, who's a contemporary classical theist, she's very brilliant. She's an Anselmian about these sort of things. She points out Anselm never mentions the doctrine of no real relations, and that's true. You see this doctrine developed by Augustine. You see it reaffirmed by Boethius and Peter Lombard and Aquinas and Scotus and so on. But you don't see Anselm affirm it. And Kate, she takes that very seriously to go, Anselm was right about this. You should not affirm this doctrine of no real relations because it's the most anti-Christian thing you could think of. You really want to say the omnipresent Lord is not really related to the universe? That's crazy. What you end up getting is, I think, a more consistent view, though. So when you look at Aristotle's God, which is, what Aquinas is trying to do, a lot of other people are trying to get this Aristotelian God. Aristotle says God is not the creator of the universe. God is not the efficient cause of the universe. God is not really related to the universe. God doesn't even know any contingent truths at all. All that's too beneath him. So God does not know that you exist. And I think that's really consistent with simplicity and timelessness, the whole package. And Aristotle says, if you affirm that God is the efficient cause of the universe, if you say God really does relate to the universe, if you say God really is aware of all these contingent truths, then you're going to have to say God's not simple, he's not impassible, he's not timeless, he's not immutable. And what you have from like Augustine and Aquinas and others is they're trying to take this Aristotelian view and trying to make it fit with Christianity. And I don't think you can do it. I think the consistent view is the Aristotelian view, where God doesn't know that you exist. God cannot possibly care about you. And that's if you want that view, that's fine. But that affects your daily life quite a bit because should I pray to a God that doesn't even know I exist? No. So my spiritual practice should change dramatically.
On that same note, one of the questions was about God and emotions, and I know
Mhm.
you worked on this as
Yeah.
well as if God has emotions analogous to humans' emotions, does this mean that God is reactive to the events in the world?
Yes. So an emotion is a felt evaluation of a situation. So emotions are always about something in the world. They're trying to track values in the world or disvalues. So this is why your emotions can be rational or irrational, and why your emotions can be true or false. Because your emotions, you might get them wrong. Like you might be really angry at something because you thought someone did something awful to you, and turns out no, they didn't at all. So your emotion is just wrong. It didn't properly track the value in the world. Um, when we're looking at God's emotions, the claim is that God's emotions are always going to be perfectly rational and perfectly good because they're always going to perfectly track the values in the world. So when you're looking at the Bible, for example, you see all these instances where God's angry at the sin of Israel. Why? Well, because it's really disvalue. Like it's a huge disvalue. Their sin is really awful. And so the perfect emotion to have in that case is to go, okay, I'm angry now. When you see in Jeremiah Israel like being destroyed, God says, I wish that my head were like a fountain, or I wish I had enough tears like the ocean so that I could, because I don't have enough tears to really cry for how sad I am for you. That's a metaphorical statement, obviously, but the metaphor is pointing towards a literal reality, which is God gets sad sometimes because the rational thing to do when you see something tragic is to be sad. So, yeah, God's emotions are going to be reactive to the world that he's freely created because that's what perfect rationality demands.
All right. Well, now that you touch upon the Bible and the Old Testament specifically, one of the questions that I've always had about this, because it always seems to me, and perhaps you'll agree with this, that the Thomist or the defender of the doctrine of divine simplicity needs to figure out and systematize philosophically the doctrine of divine simplicity and then go to the Bible and read that into it because I just can't make sense of a God that is impassible or timeless from the Bible. So my question here would be, did early Judaism or the Judaism that produced the Old Testament have any sort of metaphysics that would, or philosophy that would imply that God is pure act or simple or impassible and or timeless?
No, not at all. They don't have anything of the sort, and so you'll see this in there's a newer movement of different Jewish and Christian scholars trying to say, why don't we treat the Bible like philosophy? because we treat every other text just like it as philosophy. So why not? So Drew Johnson, Yorm Hazoni, James Diamond, some of these others, they're saying like this is philosophy. There's a certain pattern to Hebraic thought of what God is like, what morality is like. So, for example, the moral philosophy of the Old Testament is like one of the key features is empathy and compassion. It's a huge feature of the moral philosophy of the Old Testament, which makes sense when you keep seeing them say God's mercy, God's compassion never fails, His empathy never fails. And that's a very constant repeated claim because they want to say God's perfectly good. So their moral philosophy is grounded around empathy and compassion. So of course, when they're coming to articulate what God's goodness is like, they're going to say, well, it's going to fit their moral philosophy. So they've got a very unique way of thinking. When you come to look at Origin of Alexandria, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, and so on and so on, and you look at what do they say about mercy, empathy, compassion? Does God literally have those attributes? No, not analogically, because analogical predication is literal predication. God only metaphorically has compassion. And you're like, what on earth could that possibly mean? That he's metaphorically compassionate. Whereas the Old Testament's like, no, he's compassionate. He's rich in mercy. He's rich in empathy. So it's a completely contradictory view. Walter Brueggemann put it like this. Walter Brueggemann, he's a very famous Old Testament scholar. He says the Bible is in deep tension with the scholastic notion of God. So these are just two very different views on God.
Yeah, well, one of my worries on that is precisely that, as I mentioned before, usually people try, or the argument is that they try to go with divine simplicity because they want to uh, if, avoid the collapsing God and turning God into a creature.
Right.
But when they do this and they go to this radical view of divine simplicity, it seems to just throw out Christianity and Old Testament theology, New Testament theology. It collapses everything.
Yeah, so you brought up something very important here that we need to make explicit. So there is a constant concern in Christian theology to make sure we do not blur the creator-creature distinction. And when I was younger, I went hardcore Calvinist because I was like, can't blur the creator-creature distinction. And I went really hardcore Augustinian because, you gotta, for these reasons. And a couple of years ago, I published a paper called "The Creator-Creature Distinction in Debates Over Rival Models of God," because what I realized is this was an empty slogan. Because what people are doing is they're building their entire model of God into what it means to be the creator. So if you deny anything in my model of God, then you've automatically made God a creature. And I'm like, hang on, what does it really mean to be the creator? It means that you're like this being that's like all powerful and eternal, and you freely brought about a universe. And what does it mean to be a creature? You're like one of those items that this creator freely brought about. That's it. Nothing more. If you want to add in other attributes to God, please do so because I think you need to. I want to say God's perfectly wise, he's perfectly good, all that kind of stuff. But is that adding any sort of content to what it means to be the creator and what it means to be a creature? No, of course not. So God gets sad sometimes, therefore he's a created object? Well, no, of course not, because he's the necessarily existent being who freely brought about the universe. So I think when we get clear on what it really means to be a creature and really means to be a creator, you realize when you're looking at all these debates, people are building in, they're smuggling in, they're sneaking in all of their philosophical baggage. And we as Christians should do the philosophy because I love doing the philosophy. I do it all day long. But you need to be aware that how much of your own philosophical beliefs are you sneaking in without justification.
All right. Well, thank you for this very interesting discussion on divine simplicity. It's very, very enriching, and I'll need to watch it over and over again to make sure I understand everything.
Sure.
But now, some of the questions that are also related to your work on the doctrine of divine processions and the eternality of the Son and procession from the Holy Spirit and all of that. Could you give us, in a nutshell, what the doctrine of procession is, and so that we understand kind of the background of the questions that we're going to touch upon?
Yeah. So the claim you get is that the Father eternally causes the Son and Spirit to eternally exist. And somehow when the Father does that, he eternally gives them the same essence as him. So this is supposed to secure how you get the homoousios, or the same substance, in the doctrine of the Trinity. So it's an eternal cause with an eternal effect. That's the claim.
All right. Usually when I'm discussing this, I've encountered that some people want to avoid causal vocabulary, because they say that in this doctrine of the eternal generation of the Son and the procession of the Spirit, they would usually deny that this is a causal relationship. Is this denial correct? And did the Church Fathers address this as a causal dependency from the Spirit and the Son towards the Father?
Yeah, so I understand why people are uncomfortable with the causal language. I mean, even Aquinas and Scotus express they are uncomfortable with that language. They still defend the view, but they go, it just sounds Arian. And the reason it sounds Arian is because it is Arian, because that's exactly what the Arians said too. This is where the Orthodox and the Arians both agree that the Father causes the Son to exist. Where they disagree is over what the entailments are of that. So the language in the Council of Nicaea, at the Council of Nicaea, the language in what the Council of Constantinople that gives us the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed is explicitly causal. Gregory of Nazianzus says the difference between the Father and the Son is a causal relationship. And he was the president over the Constantinople Council that produced what we now call the Nicene Creed. So it's very causal. And church historians do not deny this. They do not reject it. It's only contemporary philosophers and theologians, in my experience, that get uncomfortable because they know like what causation means. And they just go, that couldn't have been what they said. And like everyone throughout history said it. It's very, very popular. Well, people feel uncomfortable with it, but they affirm it. Andrew Hollingsworth is currently working on a book manuscript on this doctrine of eternal processions. And he's just, the first half of the book is just tracing out the history from early church to the modern day and going, it's all efficient causation. Other people want to add in other kinds of causation as well, but everyone says efficient causation, maybe also formal cause, maybe also, whatever else, but definitely efficient causation.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I was about to ask, could it be like a way to save that, to save face,
Mhm.
that the ancient church fathers and had a different notion of causation that today in 21st century we don't use, that would make this doctrine not so close to Arianism?
No, they don't. They don't. Some people will try, they'll make this claim a lot, but it doesn't make any sense of the debate itself, and it doesn't make any sense of the moves that they make. So here's a very popular causal principle that you see affirmed today. Some people want to reject it, but the view is that causes are always prior to their effects. They're always temporally before their effects. You see that principle affirmed by some of the Arians. And so they're like, if the Son is caused to exist, there was a time when the Son was not, because causes are temporally before their effects.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see, what becomes the language of the Council of Nicaea is they use two different words for causation. They create a new word, the word that we translate as begotten in English. So they'll say that creation is genitos, meaning it's caused to exist in a way that it began to exist. Whereas the Son is genitos, sounds exactly the same. They just add an extra little letter in there. Is caused in a way that he did not begin to exist. So it's an eternal cause with an eternal effect. That idea of an eternal cause with an eternal effect, it predates Christianity. So they're not really coming up with a new idea. They're just trying to come up with a new term in the language that they spoke. But then a lot of people at the council forgot about that, so they went back to the original spelling of saying the Son was created. And you're like, this is a mess. This is a vocabulary mess here. But yeah, no, it's same kind of views on causation that you see throughout history that you see today. Nothing special, nothing unique.
All right, interesting. Because one of the questions that was sent was precisely because on this wording, because the Bible does mention Jesus being the only begotten Son, specifically in John 1:18 and 3:16, and on this, where we get the word translated as begotten, Michael Heiser has mentioned in one of his podcasts that, and I'm going to quote here, scholars of Greek eventually discovered, though, that the second part of the word monogenes does not come from the Greek verb genao, but rather the noun genos, which means class or kind. The term literally means one of a kind. So Jesus would be a one of a kind son of God or a unique son of God with no connotation of time, origin, or solitary existence. If this only means that Jesus is one of a kind, is there any more biblical evidence that the second person of the Trinity is eternally begotten from the Father?
Yeah, so this is a good question because it brings out what you see a lot of New Testament scholars today say, which is this just means one of a kind. And when you're thinking about the incarnation of the Son, is that unique? Is that one of a kind? Yeah, of course, it's very unique. So it's very, very unique. So the term monogenes, it's very fitting because the incarnation of God is deeply, deeply unique. It's incredibly unique. Now, can you find anything? So that's not going to get you eternal generation. Now, can you find something else that gets you eternal generation? I want to say no, because the claim is that the Father timelessly causes the Son to timelessly exist. The Bible as a whole does not have any hint of divine timelessness. All of the words for eternity are temporal words. And even when you're looking at the author of Revelation, the author of Revelation has available to them the very language of timelessness. But whoever wrote Revelation, if it's John or whomever else, intentionally used the phrase the one who was, is, and is to come, which is a deeply temporal view of God. And you don't see that language really being repeated a lot in the early church because they don't want to talk about because it sounds too temporal. So you see this very clear affirmation of divine temporality in the Bible. So you're not going to get a timeless anything. So getting a timeless cause with a timeless effect, you're just not going to get that in Scripture. Now, William Hasker, who affirms divine temporality, he disagrees with me. He thinks that the very language of Father and Son that is suggestive, at least, of some kind of causal relationship. I'm just not convinced. But yeah, but Bill Hasker, that's his response, and you're going to see that response to between him and William Lane Craig in the forthcoming book on the Trinity, Four Views. You'll see them like kind of debate this stuff a little bit.
Oh, we're pretty excited about that book. Now, before going into the more questions about this, just a small parenthesis here. Your view is that God is temporal, right? Or that time is a property of God. Is that a correct way to frame it?
Yeah, so you can have God being temporal, and then there's this extra claim that I make that's pretty crazy, but I found a lot of people throughout history, like Isaac Newton, who affirmed it. Is that time is a divine attribute. It's because time is supposed to be this natured entity that makes change possible. It's the source of moments, and it's the thing that unifies a series of moments into a coherent timeline. And when you look at God, you're like, well, God's a natured entity. He's got a nature, and he's the thing that makes change possible because he's free and he's all powerful, and he's the source of moments, and he's the thing in any theory of providence you want to affirm. Calvinism, Molinism, open theism, doesn't matter. That's the story of how God organizes or arranges a series of moments into a coherent timeline. So it's proper to attribute time to God. It's proper to say this is time.
Interesting. Then how would you deal with, for example, in Craig's defense of the Kalam and the quotes of the physicist that he brings is that time, space, and matter began to exist at the moment of creation, we would say as Christians. If time began to exist, how would this be compatible with your model?
Yeah, so the physicist stuff is easy to disagree with because a lot of the physics that says that space and time begin, they are assuming a very particular understanding of what time is that is deeply influenced by verificationism, which is this incoherent thesis of meaning that Craig also rejects. So he's written a lot on this too, like why you should reject some of the underlying metaphysics in the special theory of relativity. So, who cares? So I'm affirming what's called the absolute theory of time, whereas a lot of physicists are affirming some unstated, undefined version of the relational theory of time. So I'm just disagreeing with their understanding of time. What you could say, though, is the universe is the beginning of metricated time, because in order to measure different a series of events. First off, you need a series of events. You need a series of moments, because otherwise there's nothing to measure. Also, you need something that creates a consistent tick, a consistent change. So you need a series of moments and you need a consistent tick to develop a clock. So my claim is that when God creates a universe, God creates a clock. He's not creating time, he creates a clock. That's why my forthcoming book's called From Divine Time Maker. Does God create time? Or Divine Watchmaker? Is he just creating a watch?
Wow.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Well, pretty interesting. Well, I'm fascinated by this discussion. Going back to the
Mhm.
doctrine of divine processions, there's an analogy that has been put forward, I think, by the church fathers, but then I've heard others mention this, and that they use the analogy between the Father and the Son and the Spirit as a relationship with the sun and its sunbeams,
Mhm.
like to discuss about this eternal creation, right? That you mentioned the council and the creeds. So that the analogy is that if the sun is eternal, then its sunbeams are eternal, and it preserves the eternity of the Son and the Spirit, but they would not be a se, uh, what because they would still be dependent on the Father. So, what is your assessment of this analogy?
Yeah, I think you're right. It doesn't get you, it gets you the eternality of the Son and Spirit, but it doesn't get you aseity. It doesn't get you that they are actually of the same substance as the Father, or the same essence as the Father. And a good reason to think this is when you look at the way the analogy is used throughout Western history. So I'm reading Gersonides right now. Gersonides is a Jewish philosopher, kind of around the same time period as Aquinas. And he's deeply Aristotelian in some of his views and deeply Platonic in some of his other views. When he's looking at the creation of the world, he's giving all these arguments in favor of the universe having an absolute beginning. And one of the things he attacks is this analogy, because the Aristotelians who affirm the eternity of the universe, they use this analogy to talk about the way that the universe is eternal and eternally dependent upon God.
Mm.
So so the analogy that these church fathers are using is an analogy taken from other thinkers who are trying to talk about the relationship between God and creation. So if the analogy gives you God and creation, that's not going to help you with the Trinity, because you don't want to say the Son and Spirit are created. You want to say they're God. So I think the analogy is it goes in the direction of creator creature, not in the direction of a Trinity.
Okay, interesting. Um, well, one of the chapter directors sent a question in the chat here. It says, if we do not affirm the doctrine of the processions, how can we make sense of the homoousios of the three persons?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is you'll see this in I've got two different published debates with William Hasker on this. In the one is in the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion, and the other one is in Filozofii Rozniki, which is this Polish journal. And I think both of them are open access. At least the Polish one is open access. So there's supposed to be this argument that if you have the processions, you get a homoousios. And what I argue in a whole bunch of different places is no, because the Father is ase, he doesn't have a cause for his existence, and the Son and Spirit do have a cause for their existence, so they're not ase. So they're not homoousios. They're not the same essence. They have different essential properties. So you don't so the processions cannot possibly get you homoousios. So the worry is, well, if I get rid of the processions, how do I get homoousios? I'm like, well, you don't get homoousios with the processions. So what's the problem if I get rid of the processions? I can have the claim that um, the Son and Spirit are ase. They have the same divine attributes. Now, if that's not going to really be enough to get that they're the same being. So you're going to have to make some other claims. So you might need to make claims like God is a complex being, where the divine persons are necessarily in eternally and essentially related to each other. This is called the doctrine of perichoresis. And I think that's what you need, the additional claim you need to get the homoousios. And that has nothing to do with processions. That's a separate Trinitarian claim.
All right. Well, next question would be, some have argued that if we attribute that if all three of the persons have truly and fully the attributes of being ase and aseity, then all three persons would be God, and therefore we would have tritheism. But if that is the case, then it seems that the attributes that are what make you God, having the same attributes will imply that you are God. Therefore, only the Father would be God in this view, where only God has a deity and is a se. In your discussion with Jake from the Muslim metaphysician, the work of scholar Beau Branson was mentioned. You commented that he has a historical argument for this view. Have you dealt with his proposal, and would this present a problem for those who are not convinced of the doctrine of eternal generation?
So I've not published anything on Beau's work. Joshua Sijuwati has a very, very similar view. It's deeply inspired by Beau Branson's work. And so I've responded to him. And in the forthcoming Divine Time Maker book, I've got a whole chapter on the Trinity where I look a lot at Josh's arguments. So you'll see some of that stuff there. I've got a forthcoming episode with Beau Branson where we talk about this topic because it's one I'm still trying to get my head around because I can't figure out what he's exactly saying. Because it sounds, I mean, the view to me, like Beau Branson's view, he gives this nice historical argument that this is what the Cappadocians affirmed. But I can't tell the difference between that view and the Arian view because you've got just the Father just is God, end of story, and the divine and the Son and Spirit are these other divine beings, but they're not God properly. Only the Father is God properly. And I'm like, that looks like the Arian view. Beau's going to disagree. You'll hear him disagree in the episode because I asked him this question point blank. So I think the issue here is when you look at Beau's chapter in the forthcoming Trinity Four Views book, if you can make sense of what's going on there and explain how it's not Arianism, then it might be a problem for you if you want to reject the processions like me or like what William Lane Craig does. But I don't see how it's not Arianism. And I can't make sense of what the argument's supposed to be against my view. I really can't. So I don't feel a lot of pressure at the moment. That doesn't mean like I should like maybe I should feel pressure, but I just don't feel it at the moment.
I guess the pressure would be because of and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to make sense of that. The pressure would be, or the problem would be, because of church tradition and because this is what the church fathers believe and all of that. But well, I guess we have a safeguard us as Protestants because we don't invest the church councils and the church fathers and the creeds with infallibility or inerrancy, right?
That's part of it. So Beau Branson, he's Eastern Orthodox, and I don't know if he affirms the infallibility of the councils, because when I've talked to him a lot about this, he's like, look, I'm not even trying to say like, they have this sort of authority. I'm just trying to tell you, if you want to know what the doctrine of the Trinity is, maybe you should look at certain historical figures and historical time periods. And I'm like, that's a fair point, because yeah, that's usually where we want to start with our Trinitarian theorizing today, is we often want to turn to the 4th century. And so that's all he's trying to do. So it's a very minimal claim. But something that's important, I think, is when I read the Cappadocians, when I read Gregory of Nyssa or Gregory of Nazianzus, and when I read Eunomius, one of their big critics, all of them are making a very important claim. All of them say, we have arguments, and we want you to consider those arguments. And may God let the truth be known, but please consider our arguments. And I'm going, well, I'm trained as a philosopher, and I'm trained to consider arguments. And they told me, I've got some arguments, consider them, please. I'm like, well, okay, that's what I'll do. Do I want to give them some extra authority beyond that? Well, no, because they themselves aren't giving them this extra authority. They themselves are saying, I have arguments, please consider them. They're not saying, I got this direct word from God that this is how it is. So I'm treating them the exact way they ask me to treat them, which is as philosophers who have arguments.
All right. Thank you so much for that. All right, moving to the last section of the Q&A, and I can't believe that we are almost done with all of the questions that we had.
Yeah, we got through a lot.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting. I thank you a lot for your time on this. Molinism and your particular view of Molinism. Quite honestly, I hadn't heard about this view or your particular view until I saw your recent discussion with the Thomistic professor. I need to watch it again, to be honest, to wrap my hand around that, because it's very, very substantive but complicated for me as a layman. But as far as I understand, in your version of Molinism, it divides God's omniscience into temporal moments and not logical moments, as Molina and Craig and Plantinga and others have done. But wouldn't this imply that God learns in the succession of moments between natural, middle, and free knowledge? And how does this, well, if it does, how does this preserve the attribute of omniscience and cognitive perfection if God acquires knowledge that he didn't have before?
Yeah. So when people like John Duns Scotus comes up with this idea of these logical moments in the life of God, and the reason he does that is because when you're looking at a timeless being, it seems impossible to figure out how this timeless being is able to engage in the kind of rational deliberation that would make sense of his freedom and his providence. So Scotus says there's all these a series of logical moments in the life of a timeless God. And then Molina is deeply inspired by that. So that's why you get these distinctions that we now have between like natural and middle and free knowledge. The claim is that at the moment of the logical moment of natural knowledge, God does not know the future. Why? Well, God only knows what's necessarily true. He reflects on himself and he sees all the things that that are possible because those are all necessary truths. But that's all God knows. Does God know the future? No, because God hasn't even decided if he's going to create anything, let alone decided to create a particular universe. So there just is no fact of the matter about what will happen because God has not even made a decision. And so you see this in Scotus, you see this in Molina. Um, and then when you get to the moment of free knowledge, God has made a free choice to not just create, but to create a particular universe, this universe that we find ourselves in. So at the moment of natural knowledge, God doesn't know the future because there's no future to know. And then at the moment of free knowledge, God does know the future. And the free knowledge, according to Molinists, Calvinists, everyone, free knowledge is the basis of God's foreknowledge because now God has made a choice, a decree. This is what's going to happen in the future. So now God knows what's going to happen in the future. And all of this is supposed to be going on at one single timeless moment in the life of God. And I'm like, so from all eternity, God doesn't know the future because there are no facts about the future. And God does know the future because there are facts about the future. Well, that's a contradiction. Do I want an eternal contradiction in God? And I could give you a whole bunch of other contradictions that this generates. I could generate like a potentially infinite number of contradictions. And so you've got a huge number of eternal contradictions in God. And like, that's awful. That's bad. We don't want that. So make it temporal moments. At the first, don't make them logical moments, make them temporal moments. So you get rid of from all eternity, God doesn't know when he does know. So the worry you have is, does God learn? Well, in a sense, yes, because he goes from there is no fact of the matter about what I will do, and then now I'm going to deliberate. So he learns that he himself is deliberating, and then he learns that he himself has made a decision to select this particular universe. So you could say, yeah, God's learning in some sense. It sounds a little bit weird though, because it sounds like because typically when I learn something, it's there's some facts that are out there that I didn't know, and then I come to discover them. Whereas on this scenario, God already knows all the facts that are there, which is, I think, an entailment of God's cognitive perfection, the ability to know all the facts. And so God knows all the facts. And then because of God's decision, he's creating a new set of facts. So it wasn't the case that there was going to be a particular universe. Then God decides this is the universe I want. And so now there are facts about what will happen. And that's just Molinism, is that God settles which particular facts are going to obtain in the future. So God learns. It doesn't really seem like learning. Learning feels like a weird word to me to use.
Okay. All right. All right.
There's a lot to think about, though. I know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll need to wrap my mind about around that.
Yeah. It'll take a
Well,
few years, so maybe you'll get it. I don't know.
definitely, definitely. Um, well, now that you mention it, when God actualizes one of those feasible worlds, how is this not deterministic if he settles what's going to happen and what will happen? It wouldn't this turn him into the cause of the evil that occurs in the world that he actualized?
Yeah. So this is where these debates get really technical really fast. So I'm going to try to explain without too much technical detail. There's a difference between determinism and determinate. So take like Calvinism, for example. Calvinism says God knows the future because he knows he will causally determine all those things that are going to happen. Like he's going to, so the Calvinism, like Thomism, affirms something called the doctrine of universal divine causality, that God directly causes anything with a positive ontological status. So God directly causes you to exist. He directly causes your actions. He directly causes your beliefs and your desires, your emotions. Why do you want to do what you do? Because God directly caused you to do it. He caused you to want to do it, and he caused you to do it. Molina feels uncomfortable with that, so he fudges on that massively. And I don't like his fudge, so I'll get rid of the fudge and try to explain it without it. What he really wants to say is the truth values are determinate, which just means they have a truth value of true or false. So what will happen in the future when God issues his decree, it's true or false that this is what will happen. So it's determinate, but it's not deterministic because God's not going to directly cause all the stuff to happen. That might not get you enough to really go, do I actually have free will? Molina thinks, yeah, it's going to be enough to get you free will because God's not causing you to do all these things. But that's supposed to be the distinction between determinate and deterministic.
All right, interesting.
I don't know if that helps you, but yeah,
a little bit. I'll need to watch it again, and perhaps I'll text you or email you if I have further questions, because it's a really interesting view, but yeah, it's complicated.
It is very complicated. Honest. Yeah. What you'll see in my little book about a big God that comes out next week, I try to make all these different theories of providence as easy to understand as possible. So you can see the arguments for and against each view without too much technical jargon. So hopefully that book helps.
Thank you. All right. I guess we're down to the last question, and it's about your exchange on Molinism. I don't remember his name. I'm sorry. The Thomist author that you discussed this with.
Father Cuddy.
Cuddy. Cuddy?
Correct. Yeah.
All right. Father Cuddy said the following: all free actions, even those of God, require some element of imperfection. However, none of these imperfections reside in God. Instead, they exist within the potentialities, the capacities, and fundamental principles reside on the side of creation, whether it be to create or to redeem. And he also said, we can discuss God's free action, but the basis and foundation of that freedom lie in the imperfection of creatures. This means that anything God does external to himself is absolutely free, because anything he creates or acts upon outside of himself is not himself. If he is pure act, and what is outside of him is not pure act because it is not God, then it necessarily possesses potency and act. Where there is potency, there is freedom. I honestly have no idea what that means, and my question mainly is, how does this address one of the points that you were making, related to the flexibility of the pillar of the faith, that God is free to create or not to create, free to create this world or another world? How would you untangle this?
To be honest, it's a view that I've looked at a lot over the years. I cannot make sense of it, and I'm not the only one. So W. Matthews Grant has a book on divine universal causality and free will, where he tries to defend this kind of view in a particular way. And he has a whole section of one of his chapters just trying to address the complaint that this is unintelligible, because that's how common it is. So like William Lane Craig has looked at this view and he goes, that's unintelligible. And so Grant's going to go, I'll try to make it make sense. And when I got done finished reading the book, I was like, I still can't make sense of this. And Brian left out, he has this really funny moment in one of his papers on this, where he goes, okay, so you're saying that God is the creator of the universe, not because he did something to create it, but because the universe exists. That's the claim. Well, that means the universe just exists by pure magic. And it seems to get the order of explanation completely backwards, because the universe should exist because God did something. It's not that God is the creator because the universe exists. That doesn't make any sense. And so I think that's right. I think it's a very weird way of talking, because what you get is God's not properly speaking, God is not free. does not have freedom. And you saw Father Cuddy say that very explicitly in that debate. And that's why I told him, because he was based in Washington, D.C. And I was like, that's the most un-American thing you could say. You're denying freedom. So he took that joke very well, which is why I loved having that dialogue with him. But yeah, God does not, properly speaking, have free will. And then the universe exists, not because God did something. And I'm like, this is just weird. I just can't make sense of it. I think it's just weird. And I don't understand how it answers the objections I have. I just think it's a weird way of talking that brings about more questions that makes me scratch my head even more. And so I think that just lowers the plausibility of this view massively.
Oh, well, thank you for that, because I was starting to think that I was dumb or something because I just couldn't make sense of it. But if you can't make sense of it either, I'm in good company as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Mullins, I thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating. I could be here asking you all sorts of things. I appreciate your time and your effort and your work. We're thankful for God for everything that you've done, and that it's helping the church to get a more coherent, a more uh, dynamic approach to these philosophical questions, and to appreciate more of the philosophical and history background that we have on our Christian faith. Thank you again so much for your time.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
All right, see you around.